In welcoming you to this, the 9th revived Boyle Lecture of Modern Time, I do so with real pride after an absence of 2 years from this building. In 2010, you may recall, we were displaced by reason of the installation of our remarkable new organ, and last year, less propitiously, by the failure of our heating system in some of the sharpest days of weather in recent years. Of course, not all of the original 17th century or following series of lectures were delivered in this church building, so an element of touring is no more than imitation, to which we add the very positive and appreciated fact of the kind hospitality of our neighbours. If quizzed, I cannot say which I love the more, the organ or the boilers. But both are sources of pride, and you know who you are, of gratitude. An intellectual tradition such as these lectures proposes belongs to no one and no place in this age of communication. But we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Gresham College for their active support, to St. Paul's Institute for recording these proceedings and enabling them to be available on the internet via our Boyle lecture site shortly, to the Worshipful Company of Mercers for imaginative generosity, and in particular to the Grocers' Company, patrons of this parish, whose wisdom and generosity has guided the project towards its 10th anniversary, now happily in sight. Thank you all so very much. The manner in which the appearance of the Christ is to be seen as part of the evolutionary process and not over against it is much aired by theologians today. The presence of a Christmas crib in the sanctuary here may need explaining so late in January. And although it is conventional to observe the crib until Candlemas on Thursday of this week, it may be thought less usual to leave the Holy Family waiting in what the wags have called a post-modern bus shelter, much to my chagrin. It is our little attempt to engage the debate. This lecture is now organised by staff in the office from here, serving a distinguished group of wise trustees animated by not one but two conveners, Russell Manning, Lord Gifford Fellow at the University of Aberdeen, and Dr. Michael Byrne of this parish. Our debt to the latter gentleman, as this series moves to exceptional maturity, will be known to all, and I'm privileged to introduce you to him now. Dr. Michael Byrne.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, may I join with George in welcoming you to the 9th in the new series of Boyle Lectures on Science and Theology. Apart from expressing amazement at the fact that the series has now been running since 2004, my duties this evening are happily limited: to introduce the speakers and to say how good it is to be back here in St. Mary-le-Bow this year on our home ground. Our previous lectures have covered much ground in looking at the dynamic of the science-theology relationship in the early 21st century. John Barrow discussed cosmological points of conversation between the two disciplines. Philip Clayton examined the new emphasis on emergence in natural systems. Malcolm Jeeves took us to psychology and related issues. And John Hedley Brooke took a historical turn, looking at Robert Boyle's legacy then and now. And last year, Jürgen Moltmann gave us a profound meditation on interactions between science and theology in concepts of nature, time, and the future. But what Darwinian evolution might mean for theology has been a constant of the series, being dealt with so far by 3 Boyle lecturers: John Haught, Simon Conway Morris, and Keith Ward. Celia Deane-Drummond continues that examination this evening. Celia held a professorship in theology and the biological sciences at Chester until shortly after she was invited to give the 2012 Boyle Lecture, when she took up a new and distinguished professorship in theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana in the US. The lesson is obvious: giving the Boyle is good for your academic career. She graduated in natural science from Cambridge and obtained a doctorate in plant physiology at Reading, before turning her attention to theology and obtaining a doctorate in systematic theology from Manchester. She has published extensively, and this evening's lecture draws on her important 2009 book, Christ and Evolution, Wonder and Wisdom. Laurent Schulz is Professor of Theology and Philosophy at the University of Agder in Kristiansand in Norway. He holds doctorates in philosophical theology and educational psychology, and is also internationally recognized for his work in this field. We are delighted to have such distinguished speakers this evening, and it's my pleasure now to invite Celia Deane-Drummond to give the 2012 Boyle Lecture on Christ and Evolution, a Drama of Wisdom.
Ladies and gentlemen, and assembled distinguished guests, I feel very honoured to have been invited to deliver this 9th Boyle Lecture in the new series. I would therefore like to extend my thanks to Lord Cork Honorary and the other distinguished trustees of the Boyle Lecture Series for nominating me to deliver this lecture. To Dr. Russell Remanning for the kind letter of invitation, and to the Reverend George Bush of St. Mary Le Bow Church for the provision of this magnificent venue. The title of my lecture today actually has a question mark. Christ and Evolution, a Drama of Wisdom. This is deliberate on my part, because the purpose of my lecture tonight is exploratory and designed to evoke questions and explore new avenues in this engagement of how we think about Christ and accounts of evolution. My basic thesis is as follows. First of all, in the evolutionary debate so far, there has been a concentration on the relationship between God and evolution. And my question is, why have we missed out Christ? The response, on the other hand, to many who have thought carefully about the relationship between God and evolution, or even Christ and evolution to some extent, has been to adapt the theology to the science. To start with the science and, if you like, merge the theology to that science in order to make it easier to believe the theology. However, I argue that if we go down this route, that undermines the distinctive mark of the Christian faith. At the same time, we need to be aware of the importance of the evolutionary accounts and not destroy what science is trying to tell us. So I propose to you tonight an alternative reading, one that can be faithful to more traditional ways of thinking about who Christ is, but also can take into account those accounts we learn in science. And I propose dramatics as the key paradigm, and then weave evolution into that dramatic account. So I'm making 3 basic points in this lecture. First of all, the classic traditions about Christ have been debates about who Christ is ever since the early church, and those debates continue in the modern responses that we find today. The second point is this: I seek to develop a theological drama through wisdom, with Christ in the central act. And thirdly, evolution needs to be woven in to that dramatic account, including contemporary debates about the evolutionary story. And if we think about what is particularly different in the Christian faith compared to all the other religious traditions, it's the issue of Christ's incarnation as God's word made flesh. But it's evolved flesh, not just any old flesh. What then is the significance of the incarnation when we start to think about God's action in the evolutionary account? When we reflect on Richard Dawkins' new atheism, he seeks not simply to dispense with God, but also claims it is a falsehood. Evolutionary biologists are rather more savvy than Richard Dawkins often is, that is, other evolutionary biologists, because they are now starting to make more sophisticated claims that religion has actually evolved for good reasons. It's not a falsehood that's like a parasite, as it were, on the human species. More conservative believers react to Dawkins' account, perhaps understandably, and by associating Dawkins with evolution, they reject both his atheism and his evolution in one package. The problem seems to be this: how can theology be true to itself as theology, but also take into account scientific accounts of evolution? Robert Boyle saw the pressures of science in his day, and he saw that there was a need to defend Christianity from these pressures. But his tone was conciliatory. His wisdom is vitally relevant today. Even then, the questions were asked about whether a real scientist could combine Christian faith, or if they did seek to combine faith, then maybe the faith wasn't true. And this is the point that John Hedley Brooke made when in his address. So in other words, he recognized the need for a genuine, open dialogue. And I think the need today is ever more acute when we see the rise of creationism in schools, even in the UK, and it's even more pronounced where I happen to be working at the moment. So we need then a constructive engagement between theology and evolutionary science. Tensions are bound to remain. I suggest if there are no tensions when we finish this exercise, then either theology will have merged with science and there'll be no distinction, or maybe it'll be divorced from science, or perhaps non-competing with it, or maybe even will have been explained away by that science in a kind of post-Christian discourse. But let's turn then to the Christian tradition and what it said in the early church, just as a brief preliminary remark before we get into some of the contemporary discussion. The early church held heated debates on how to combine Christ's humanity and his divinity, as well as Christ's personhood. The Chalcedon Council of 451 named Christ as both one person but two natures, divine and human. But how could divine and human nature coexist? Would humanity be destroyed by divinity, or would divinity be weakened by humanity? In the end, the compromise that was reached was either an Alexandrian stress on Christ's divinity or an Antiochian stress on Christ's humanity. But the tension was still there. It was left, as it were, unresolved. Further theoretical discussion follows about whether the humanity that we find in Christ was abstract in an abstract universal, or whether it simply referred to a particular human nature in Christ. All these discussions are abstract in a sense, closed in that they are internal to theology, but they also are logical, but they're internal logical debates. If I start talking in this language to evolutionary biologists, they return my discussion with a blank stare. What possible relation could this discussion have to evolutionary biology? One way out of the problem is to stress the humanity of Christ so much that this is all that we can say about who Christ is. And he becomes, as it were, an exemplar of what it is to be human. Here, Christ appears in evolution as a form of human perfection. And the emergent Christ is one who responds to the divine will. Now, this in one sense is satisfying because it, if you like, combines our understanding of who Christ is with the evolutionary story. But the problem is the Chalcedon account of Christ as the Word of God incarnate seems to be compromised. Would I really be inclined to worship Christ as perfected humanity or not? I think, therefore, we need an alternative framing, one that allows us to be more in tune with the traditional account, but also one that's open to the scientific discussion. Evolution is history, it's biological history, and this, as it were, is the clue to how we can begin to unwrap this difficult puzzle. If we portray evolution as an overarching story, or what some theologians call a grand narrative, then it leads to a sense of inevitability. We very often feel that sense of inevitability when we talk about the evolutionary process, one organism leading to another. It seems to us as if the story is never ending and it has a particular direction. I suggest we need a different reading of history than this understanding of evolution as an overarching story. A different way is one that focuses on drama. In drama, we have an emphasis on the actors. There is a plot, but the focus is on specific acts, and the stress is on freedom and contingency. If we include God in this drama, we have Theodrama. Theodrama adds in, as it were, the future as God understands it, or in theological terms, eschatology. The language here, I think, is very important, because if we use the language of overarching story or grand narrative, it's a type of storytelling where we are just observers, watching, as it were, the evolutionary account and watching what happens, standing outside that account. It leads to a false sense of being objective. And this is not, I should add, what Darwin really intended. So these are the popularizers of evolution, although there are some scientists, unfortunately, that seem to portray it in the way they popularize their science. So it's a kind of deterministic view of evolution and a false objective account. On the other hand, if we use the language of drama, the stress here is on contingency, on the unexpected event, on unexpected twists and turns in the story. We are free agents. We have a role to play in the drama. If we turn now to the Incarnation and think then of the Incarnation as a Trinitarian drama, then the Logos is an expression of the Son incarnate in the flesh. Mary's reception of the divine Logos, or wisdom, is the beginning of the drama in the sense that it's the key act in the Theodrama. Her yes could have been no. Here, the divinity of Christ is veiled. We have a human, a vulnerable baby, the same as you and me. In the Incarnation, then, there was an act of God's profound love in a self-emptying process, but without loss of divinity. But the power and the wisdom of love is paradoxical, because here we see mortal flesh appearing in a baby, and then eventually in the cross, in the death of Christ on that cross. I suggest at this point, all we see is Christ's humanity. We see very little of his divinity apart from occasional glimpses. It's only after the resurrection that the divinity of Christ becomes fully visible. Like many others who've looked at the relationship between Christ and evolution, Christ's obedience is important, but it's still woven into the drama with other players. The dramatic story of his life, as it were, sets the scene for how we are to think of our own lives. I've touched then on the drama of the incarnation. But what about the place of evolution itself in that drama? Is evolution a backdrop or a stage to human history? This is how some theologians have talked about evolution or creation. But if evolution is also history, which I've been suggesting, then there's no reason why it has to be just a backdrop or a stage. The main act certainly is Christ's coming, but evolution also displays dramatic elements. And the evolution of human beings in particular is one that shows some of these dramatic events, in particular high profile. Only among the various hominid species we find one, Homo sapiens, that became religious. I'm leaving to one side for the moment various debates that are current amongst anthropologists that perhaps Neanderthals had a religious instinct as well. Neanderthals have had a particularly bad press, I think. But if we leave that to one side, there is still a heated debate amongst biologists about exactly when and why religion appeared in Homo sapiens. It wasn't there, as it were, from the very beginning. What, then, if the capacity for religious belief itself brings evolutionary advantages? Is God explained away? This is an anxiety for some of those drilling into this particular area of research. I would say that God is not explained away, not if it's suitably qualified in its claims, that is, the evolutionary accounts, because we have to take into account that the evolutionary explanations are, first of all, limited to biological reasons, and secondly, do not address the content of faith or discern the complexity of cultural or religious experience. I will give you an example to show you what I mean. I may love my child, in fact, I do love my child, both my children, but the biological and psychological reactions that are mapped onto my brain in order to describe something of what is going on in that love process is not all there is to say about my relationship with my children. The relationship, in other words, is real and it goes beyond the biological accounts. And I would say the same thing about the relationship between evolution and religious belief. We may, and this is still controversial, come to have biological accounts of why religion appeared in human history. But that doesn't mean to say that this is all there is to say about that relationship. We can say, in other words, that the drama of human history begins with a recognition of God. And we find that this is also mapped in the book of Genesis. The Genesis account talks about Adam and Eve, and if we adapt this to an evolutionary account, we have to think of Adam and Eve in prehistorical terms. Some theologians want to hold on to the view that they were historical figures. I don't think it's necessary myself, but that's an area of theological debate. Let's move on. What about the other creatures, the other mortal creatures that we share our creaturely home with? Are they more than simply a stage for human action in our hominid species as we gradually move towards a religious belief? They too, I suggest, are woven into the drama. Of course, the degree of awareness of the divine will be very different, but they still have a role to play in the overall drama. Only humans are self-aware. Only humans are self-consciously, religiously aware. There is a problem, however, if we start thinking about evolution in dramatic terms, or maybe it's not a problem. But large parts of the text are fairly boring. There's an act, but nothing seems to be happening. There are long epochs of history where nothing much seems to be going on in evolutionary terms. Some characters disappear, some appear, some seem to reach dead ends. The study of hominids that I've only just touched on tonight opens up vast areas of human ignorance. But this hominid species, this species that we look at with so much trepidation, is only one scene in a 500-volume account of evolution. Our minds cannot really fathom the full theodramatic act, so we have to constrict ourselves for the purposes of our sanity for one or two scenes. Only Homo erectus survived in the arid regions of Africa. Other hominids apparently disappeared, unable to cope with the climatic conditions that were prevailing at the time. So there seems to be tragedy woven into the evolutionary account. As Tennyson suggested, nature is red in tooth and claw. There are extinctions, there are unresolved problems. It's a very messy and a very bloody process. But tragic is also accounted for if we use the language of drama, in the way it's not if we use the language of overarching story. If we use the overarching story idea, we tend to forget about the tragedies. We sort of brush them to one side. But drama encourages us to think of these tragic events. And when Christ is included, that tragedy is also transformed, because the tragedy then becomes a comedy, because the ending is a happy one. The language of drama then forces us to think about human agency and subjectivity. And in theological terms, humans deliberately enter into history and take their place. If we begin, what I have tried to do so far then is to show that instead of starting with science and then trying to adapt theology to think in scientific ways, we need to think theologically first and then start worrying about the science and how that can be incorporated without losing, as it were, the scientific message that is there, but at the same time not losing what theology might have to contribute. So if we begin with theodrama, does evolution still make sense in its current formulations? And at this point in the lecture, I want to give you 3 examples of current evolutionary debates to show you, as it were, how this could still make sense in terms of current thought. My first example is an example of microevolution. Here we have heated debates about the means of natural selection. And natural selection, of course, is the process by which only the fittest survive and reproduce to the next generation. The debate I'm thinking of is that between Stephen Jay Gould, he's now, as it were, deceased, but in a sense the intellectual debate is relatively recent, and Simon Conway Morris, who gave one of the lectures a few years ago. I can't remember the year, but anyway, he's in the calendar of Boyle lectures. Stephen Jay Gould stresses contingency in evolution, and forgive me if you've heard this already from Simon Conway Morris. Stephen Jay Gould stresses contingency in evolution, but also constraints. The constraints he talks about are ones associated with evolutionary specialization. So the more specialized a particular organism becomes to its environment, the less able it is to cope with changes, because that specialization reduces the capacity for further evolution. So he does include this idea of constraint, but it's somewhat limited. The way we get to those constraints is random for Gould, a random evolutionary walk. If you were to play the tape of life again, Homo sapiens wouldn't be sitting here listening to this lecture. Simon Conway Morris, on the other hand, talks about evolutionary convergence. Here he finds similarity in form and function across a range of different species, with very different genetic bases in some cases. But there are similar environmental conditions. So what he suggests is that there's some sort of directional signal going on in evolution. In other words, it's not simply a random walk. If we were to play the tape of life again, Homo sapiens would be sitting here tonight. I'm not saying I would be delivering the lecture. Human beings, then, are inevitable. Inevitable in a lonely universe. If we talk about these two alternatives in theodramatic terms, then Gould is pure improvisation. Conway Morris, on the other hand, likes to think of some sort of plot in the drama. There is a vague direction in it, but exactly what that might be, he's not sure, except that he will say that the continuing convergences give him a feeling of being uncanny. Now, I don't think we should slot God just into the uncanny spots in evolution, but it does show, as it were, the uncertainties in the evolutionary account. My second example comes from some very recent work on the relationship between evolution and development. Some scholars think that there are far more that our development of organisms is tied into a genetic basis more than others. All admit that there is environmental impact on gene expression and regulation in very complex ways. Only some genes are active in evolutionary terms if we start to study the development of different creatures. I'm going to give you one example. If you're not a scientist and you find you'd rather switch off at this point, then now's the time to have a rest. I'm going to talk here about the regulation of genes for patterns of hairs on the fruit fly larva. Now, I've deliberately chosen this example. This comes from David Stern, who's a biologist at Princeton, who actually came to give a lecture in the institution where I work recently. But this particular example, in this example, he shows that one gene is crucial for the regulation of the pattern of hairs on the fruit fly larva. This particular gene is fed into by a battery of other genes, and then this gene then regulates a battery of other genes. So it's extremely complicated. The particular gene is called shaven baby. I think biologists have a sense of humor because the shaven refers to the lack of hairs and the baby is because it's a larva. So shaven baby is the only gene, as it were, that's responsive in evolutionary terms. All the other genes don't seem to respond to evolutionary pressures. The point of this story is this: if we find such excruciating complexity of the regulation of hairs on a fruit fly larva, how can we start to think about the development of human beings and the regulation of the genetic processes in that? And I also become rather more skeptical about claims for a tight genetic basis for complex behavior in humans. It strikes me as almost impossible to unfathom, but also, as it were, there are the environmental issues and the cultural issues, as it were, that we're facing, means that claims for any tight genetic basis for human behavior need to be treated with a certain amount of skepticism. But the other point of this story is this: that there is an astonishing degree of flexibility of gene expression in environmental pressures. It implies that at a deep cellular and organism level, there's a flexibility in response, but also a constraint. And you get the picture now: constraint and flexibility. It's compatible then, as it were, with a theodramatic account. Of course, theodrama in the fullest sense only becomes conscious of itself in self-aware humans. And if we look at the development of children, it's only at a certain stage that they start to recognize the sense of their own agency. We share then in our sense of performance with other creatures. And this leads into my third example. My third example is about theories of cooperation amongst evolutionary biologists. Martin Nowak is the inspiration for this little particular interlude. He is a biologist at Harvard University who spent most of his life applying mathematical theories to a study of cooperative behavior. He has found that social groups cooperate, but also some individuals may cheat or defect. He's also found that cooperation is built into the very cellular mechanisms of a vast majority of different organisms. The question then comes to us: can we compare biological cooperation that he finds, for example, in ants, with moral deliberation in humans? I would say that they are certainly not the same, but they're not completely disconnected either. It's incorrect to assume that only humans have moral agency. Some sophisticated social species also have a morality of a sort in their own worlds. Of course, it depends also on how we define that morality as to whether we want to include other species or not. But the point is that in human societies, they do not just operate in the abstract. There's a sense in which we share our evolutionary lineage with other creatures. Perhaps we can say that natural selection selects for a general capacity to cooperate, and then that's built up and developed in human cultures and societies. There are variants of evolutionary psychology which stress specific mental modules in evolutionary terms. I think this evidence is very speculative. On the other hand, we can think of evolution as a form of convergence, like Simon Conway Morris suggests, except that now wisdom or cooperation is developing in sort of parallel ways. Perhaps there is natural wisdom and wild justice. At the same time, the possibility of things not going right, the opposite of cooperation, is termed in theological terms sin. So instead of talking about cheating or free riding, theologians have a language for this. It's sin. Even in this view, in the view of the classics like Thomas Aquinas, individual who sins still thinks it's good for them. And this is the classic position of the cheater. in Novak's theory of cooperation. The drama is this: there's the possibility of the good, cooperation, but also the possibility of evil, or cheating. So we have, as it were, a self detached from the community in one who cheats. What Martin Novak suggests is, though, that long-term cheats are selected out, and we have evolved stronger on the side of cooperation than cheating. So perhaps we should take heart that the drama may, as it were, be biased or skewed towards cooperation rather than cheating. How can we draw a few conclusions about thinking about Christ as the theodrama? What does it mean to speak of Christ as the way, the truth, and the life? I suggest at this point that Christ does set a pattern for the dramatic lives that we lead, and for ourselves as human beings in particular. The capacity of Christ to act in certain ways was partly influenced by inherited characteristics, but it was also an educative process. We don't need to dwell on the Gospels for very long to know that he learnt in a community, and he also learnt in his particular culture. He was embedded in a culture of his time. At the same time, his dedication to God allowed the transformative action of God's grace to work in his life. Of course, a biologist, qua evolutionary biologist, would exclude that such action is possible, that is, the action of God's grace. But I don't think a theologian can deny the reality of grace. And in theological terms, we can talk about the humanity in Christ being divinized, but at the same time, Christ's divinity being more than simply this version of divinization. Perhaps we can say that in biological terms, the absolute cooperation is reached when we see Christ. Is this what Romans 8 means? Is this what Romans 8 means when it talks about the crucial role of humans in the theodrama? The other creatures, as it were, are edging forward, watching humans, looking and longing for humans to act in a certain way. And this is the way many exegetes, including James Dunn, has talked about the account of Romans 8. He talks about it as a drama. I think today we need to face up to the ecological and social problems of our generation. We need hope and inspiration that the final act in the vast and long evolutionary drama in which now humans are taking an active part is not one that will be pitched towards self-destruction. Christ then points to an alternative way of being in the drama, a way of learning to be creaturely, to express creaturely wisdom in relation to divine wisdom. But a full participation of creaturely wisdom in divine wisdom is something we can hope for, not in this life, but in the next. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
I would also like to begin by thanking Michael Byrne, Russell Manning, Reverend Bush, and the trustees of the Boyle Lectures, and of course, Professor Deane-Drummond for her lecture and the opportunity to respond. I've titled my brief responsive comments, Wising Up, the Evolution of Natural Theology. This is a play on words, an adaptation and expansion of images and metaphor that Professor Deane-Drummond uses in her Boyle lecture and in the broader context of theology. In more than one sense, her work illustrates the wising up of theology, which also, in more than one sense, has been and must continue to evolve within its own complex niche of overlapping ecclesial, social, and academic environments. My response has two parts. First, I call attention to the value and significance of Professor Deane-Drummond's proposal for the ongoing development of Christian theology, as it engages the empirical findings and theoretical developments of biology. In fact, I think her proposal is an exemplar of the kind of theological response one ought to offer in this particular approach. However, simply praising the main speaker does not get us very far. So in the second part of my response, I'll outline some challenges to this very way of proposing. Challenges which, in my view, must be taken yet more seriously, even and perhaps especially by the vanguard of theological engagement with the natural sciences. What further adaptation, if any, will be necessary for natural theology to survive or perhaps even thrive within a competitive intellectual environment of the contemporary academy? Can theology really find its own niche, or will it be compelled to migrate or adapt in some other way? So first, the Sophianic theodrama hypothesis as a religious adaptation. My use of the term adaptation is not intended negatively in any way. The transmission of any tradition from generation to generation requires a balance between maintaining the integrity and coherence of the system and developing new functionally adequate responses to environmental changes. This also applies to Christian theology, as well as natural theology, which has indeed evolved since the first Boyle lectures and now must continue to adapt. Metaphorically speaking, we can think of Christian theological hypotheses as complex functional strategies for nourishing and nurturing a particular set of religious communities in a late modern scientific and philosophical environment. Some might find it tempting to simply repeat fossilized formulations without engaging science. Others to concede to any and all scientific challenges without concern for the integrity of the community. One path leads to the petrification, the other to the dissolution of the Christian tradition. As clearly articulated in her lecture this evening, Professor Deane-Drummond takes the difficult middle way between the twin temptations of ignoring and idolizing science. There is indeed much wisdom in her approach, materially as well as methodologically. Her material hypothesis is quite complex, but the central claim, I think, can be summarized in this way. Christians may interpret Jesus Christ as the dramatic expression of the wisdom of God in a way that is compatible with contemporary evolutionary theory. She provides many arguments and warrants for this claim in her work. I think she tries to fulfill all four of what we might call the desiderata of Christian theology, accounting for the biblical witness, engaging the tradition, trying to resolve philosophical or rational issues, and a plausible elucidation of human experience. Although it did not play a large role in her work tonight, in her other work she deals with the wisdom tradition as it applies to Christ. For example, the wisdom is described in the Wisdom of Solomon as holding all things together. This is applied in Colossians to Christ. Professor Deane-Drummond also appropriates a vast array of resources in her work from different streams within the Christian theological tradition. She's committed to maintaining the intuitions behind the Chalcedonian Creed, while still squarely facing the shift in what fully human means today. She also exhibits a commitment to the last two desiderata, doing theology in a way that is intellectually and existentially responsible. She offers real arguments for her position and engages real concerns facing humanity, including the environmental crisis. Deane-Drummond's integration of this Sophianic, or wisdom tradition, and the dramatic, especially as developed by Hans Urs von Balthasar and others, provides a way of attending carefully to the element of tragedy within the human longing for wisdom. This appears to be the wisest strategy to adapt, in my view, if one's goal is reconstructing the classical doctrines of Christology in dialogue with science. There's certainly internal objections that one could raise. Some might worry her proposal is a form of adoptionism. Others might wonder where the Protestants are in her review of the tradition. Some would be concerned that her emphasis on contingency and constraint too easily leads to a rejection of divine omnipotence. Also, what about the problem of evil? Her Sophianic theodrama hypothesis does deal respectfully with the tragedy of creaturely suffering, but it does not ultimately explain why an omnibenevolent being would allow it. Now, such concerns are not unique to Deane-Drummond's proposal. These are the kind of problems all Christian theologians must deal with. In my view, the general adaptive strategy that she has developed is one of the best options available for theologians within the Christian tradition. Rather than focus on these internal questions, in the second part of my response, I want to look at the adaptive task with a wider lens. What is happening to the niche within which theology, especially natural theology, is attempting to adapt? Exactly why and how is it attempting to adapt within this late modern niche? So, secondly, is the natural niche of Christian theology shrinking? As I indicated in the first part of my response, theological hypotheses are a kind of religious adaptation. In other words, whatever else they are, they're strategies developed within religious coalitions to survive and thrive. The term religion is contentious in almost every environment, but for the sake of these brief comments, I will use it in a way that's increasingly common among scientists in fields such as paleoarchaeology, cognitive science, moral psychology. Religion is, for these purposes, shared imaginative engagement with supernatural agents. Here, supernatural simply means not necessarily embodied in the natural causal nexus. An agent refers to any entity or force that is attributed intentionality. The constellation of disciplines I just referred to, I call the biocultural study of religion. It offers compelling evidence that this feature of humanity, that is, widespread interaction with discarnate, intentional entities, has been exhibited in all known human societies, past and present. In the sense we use the term theology today, it has evolved relatively late in human history. Only with the emergence of complex literate states about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, where the unity of belief, ritual, and social identity was problematized by increasingly pluralistic encounters. During the axial age, the idea of one ultimate supernatural agent emerged in different ways across East, South, and West Asia in very different forms. Christian theology is one example of a West Asian monotheism. Its idea of an agent whose transcendent intentionality is considered to be the ground for inclusion or exclusion with an ultimate supernatural coalition. In this sense, we could say that theology itself, the discipline, was an adaptive strategy that helped religious organizations transmit their modes of engagement with the supernatural to new generations. So axial age religion was its original and natural social niche. In another sense, however, theology, like science, is not natural. Thinking scientifically and theologically is hard work, requires extensive training. These intellectual engagement strategies must be cultivated. Thinking, however, as well as acting and feeling religiously, is natural. That is, shared imaginative engagement with supernatural agents or gods comes naturally to human beings today because of the phylogenetic inheritance of cognitive and coalitional mechanisms that helped our early ancestors survive. Let me briefly describe what I call these theogonic or God-bearing mechanisms. First, research in cognitive psychology suggests that gods are born naturally in the human mind as a result of a hypersensitive cognitive device that detects agency in the natural environment when confronted with ambiguous phenomena. This first sort of mechanism helped some of our ancestors find or avoid important agents like predators, prey, protectors, and partners. However, the hypersensitivity of this cognitive tendency to detect intentionality led to many false positives. So faces are detected in the clouds, ghosts in the shifting shadows or smoke, divine blessing or punishment, and unpredictable weather patterns. But of course, not all of these detected supernatural agents stick around. Although gods may easily appear in the mental space of human life, it takes a village to nurture and care for them. In other words, supernatural agents must be born with an E, born in a special way within the social space of human life. The gods that stick around are those that are interpreted as having some social interest in and power over what happens to the particular in-group. Once detected, shared engagement with these gods, who are always watching and able to punish or reward, can lead to a decrease in cheating and defection in outgroups, to outgroups. The second sort of mechanism helps to explain, among other things, the emergence of altruistic behavior in a way that is consistent with natural selection. The cohesion of a group is protected when its members do not hurt one another and are even willing to signal costly commitment to the coalition by hurting themselves, for example, participating in painful rituals or other forms of self-sacrifice, or even hurting members of outgroups, that is, promoting exclusive or violent practices. Empirical findings within these disciplines suggest that these detection-protection mechanisms come naturally to most people. So where does theology come in? Part of the tragedy of the theologian, to use Pascal Boyer's phrase, is that the vast majority of regular religious believers do not really need abstract doctrinal arguments about the incarnation of ultimate supernatural agents, for example, to hold together their everyday lives mentally and socially. Even if such regular religious people can articulate the orthodox doctrine of God authorized by the Church at Chalcedon, psychological studies and even a moment's reflection on our own experience of or as religious believers shows that under stress, people automatically collapse back into the natural default, the detection of supernatural agents, such as angels, saints, or even the risen Jesus, who are interested in the protection of their own smaller in-group. Those of us who have labored long in both academic and ecclesial environments know how difficult it is to get many believers to understand or even see the importance of complicated doctrines like the incarnation. So what does any of this have to do with the evolution of natural theology? Theology in general may have emerged in the axial age, but the environmental niche in which natural theology evolved was the competition of ideas within early modern science and philosophy, in which only the empirically sustainable and explanatorily powerful survived. Natural theology has traditionally been distinguished from revealed or confessional theology, which appeals explicitly to the detection of divine intention, for example, in a holy text, codifying and to some extent managing the coalition's shared engagement with its supernatural agent. This latter kind of theology serves an adaptive purpose. It holds together the coalition in a more or less hostile social environment. Now, Professor Deane-Drummond's project seems to blur the lines, and appropriately, I think, between revealed and natural theology. In my view, this distinction itself is a remnant of other ancient and early modern dualisms. However, we can still ask the question, in what niche and for what purpose does her Sophianic theodrama hypothesis operate? Her description of the task she selected makes it clear. Her proposal is meant to function as a way of protecting the cohesion of some parts, at least, of the Christian tradition as it adapts to a changing conceptual environment. But we might wonder about the viability of that other task, namely, the development of theological hypotheses that could function in a broader context of the academy or even public discourse as, quote, defenses of Christianity in the wake of pressures from natural science. It seems to me that the latter would require argumentation that does not appeal directly to controversial interpretations of the revelation of or shared engagement with the supernatural agents of one's own coalition. In other words, it would require something like classical natural theology. This may have been part of Robert Boyle's intention when he indicated his desire that the original lecture series should not deal with controversies between Christians, that is, with issues that might highlight or even widen fractures within the coalition. But it also seems to me that the conceptual environment within which such argumentation could be productive or even possible is shrinking rapidly. And this is the key. Theologians who are concerned about the psychological and political health of Christian or other coalitions need to wise up to the fact that this niche may even be in danger of disappearing as the territory is taken over by naturalist and secularist intuitions. Debates across the sciences and within the public sphere increasingly reject appeals to supernatural agency or coalitional authority in arguments about the causal nexus of the physical world or the normative organization of the social world. Professor Deane-Drummond describes her task as a demonstration of the possibility of a compatibility between a reconstructed articulation of the doctrine of the incarnation and a scientifically responsible acknowledgement of the explanatory power of cutting-edge evolutionary theory. She explicitly notes that science itself has no need for such demonstration of compatibility. What then is the environmental niche within which such proposals can serve a productive or even reproductive function? Are they necessarily limited to the church or a church? Can these hypotheses only survive within the guilds of confessional theologians and religious professionals? Professor Deane-Drummond's other work has consistently called our attention to the ecological crises of our world and urged theologians to contribute. In my view, if theology, natural or otherwise, is to survive, or even, I dare to hope, thrive intellectually and pragmatically in such a global environment, it may, I dare to suggest, also have to develop new adaptive strategies that do not include arguments based on the detection and protection of our own favored supernatural agent coalitions. Let us hope that the niche created by the revival of the Boyle Lectures continues to provide an environment within which such questioning can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to bring this evening's formal proceedings to a close with a few words of thanks. But before I do, I want to take the opportunity to whet your appetite for next year's lecture. I'm delighted to announce that the 2013 Boyle lecturer will be the Reverend Professor John Polkinghorne, eminent physicist and theologian. It will be a great honour to be able to welcome John as the 2013 Boyle lecturer, and an occasion to celebrate his rich contribution to work at the interface of science, religion, and theology, both in his academic and his more popular writings. And indeed, next year will be very much a year of celebration for us, a celebration of 10 years of the revived Boyle Lectures. Since 2004, when Michael Byrne revived the series first begun in 1692, we've been privileged to have hosted a distinguished group of theologians, scientists, philosophers, and historians. To mark this occasion, I'm pleased to say that we will be publishing a book with SCM Press that will reproduce with commentaries the texts of the first 10 in what we hope will be an ongoing series of reflections on the relations between science and theology in the 21st century. For those of you who can't wait that long to get your hands on a copy of this evening's lecture and response, I'm happy to say that there are booklets available for you as you leave the church. Please do help yourself to a copy of the booklet. Thank you. So much for next year. I now want to extend my thanks for this year's lecture. Firstly, I would like to thank you all for coming and joining us this evening on a not too cold, but nonetheless, January evening. It's a pleasure to see you all here. I like to extend my thanks to my co-convener, Michael Byrne, to George Bush, Rector of St Mary Le Bow, to my fellow trustees, and to all of those who support the Boyle Lectures. We are very grateful. But of course, most importantly, I'd like to thank this evening's lecturer, Professor Celia Deane-Drummond, and our respondent, Professor Leron Schultz. You have given us much to reflect upon, themes of Christology, evolution, and wisdom, and we're enormously grateful. Thank you both. Thank you.